He wasn't just an emperor. He was a curse in human form. Commodus ruled not with wisdom, but with whips, blades, and blood. He renamed months after himself, paraded as a god, and turned the Colosseum into a slaughterhouse for his twisted pleasures. He forced senators to kneel, made nobles bleed for sport, and watched Rome rot while he cheered in gold. But behind the silk curtains of power, a blade was waiting. What happens when a monster thinks he's invincible? You're about to uncover the darkest secrets of Rome's most insane emperor, and why his own allies couldn't wait to kill him. He wasn't born to rule, nor raised to command, yet he craved more than power. He wanted the blood of others on his hands while the crowd roared his name, and what began as whispered tales of a boy obsessed with gladiators soon became a reign soaked in violence, humiliation, and terror. When Commodus took the throne, the arena was no longer a stage for brave men, but a playground for a lunatic emperor who dressed as Hercules, wearing lion skins and carrying a club, believing himself divine, and unlike his predecessors who ruled from marble halls, he chose the sand of the Colosseum, where he slaughtered animals and criminals, not for justice, but for joy, stabbing terrified men while the public watched in confusion and fear, unsure whether to cheer or look away. Because every performance was a gamble with death, not just for the fighters, but for anyone who didn't clap loud enough. And while the senators shivered behind their togas, too frightened to challenge him, Commodus began charging the state enormous sums for his performances, bankrupting the treasury for every swing of his sword. And when he wasn't killing in the arena, he was forcing gladiators to lose on purpose, making them kneel before him so he could reenact his twisted fantasies of godhood. And those who refused met a quieter death in the prison cells below the amphitheater, their bodies fed to lions before anyone could ask questions. And behind the scenes, the emperor's madness grew darker still as he kept rooms filled with wax dolls resembling his enemies, practicing killing them with daggers before turning his fantasies into reality, dispatching spies to listen in on every whisper in the Senate, marking names on a secret scroll he kept beneath his bed, a kill list that grew longer by the day, and his lust for cruelty didn't end there. Commodus began inviting noblewomen into his palace not as guests, but as prey, making them watch his violent matches, then dragging them into chambers where consent held no meaning, and silence was enforced by gold coins or a sword to the throat. And when rumors spread of his nightly orgies dressed as a gladiator god, few dared to speak aloud, because anyone who mentioned the word insane in the same breath as his name was either nailed to a cross in secret or vanished into the dark tunnels under the city. And he ruled not with law, but with spectacle, turning executions into pageants, where the condemned were forced to reenact tragic myths, only to be burned alive, torn apart by wild beasts, or butchered by the emperor himself in front of screaming crowds. And when plague struck Rome, he blamed it on the gods being displeased and executed dozens of priests and augurs to satisfy his bloodlust, never once taking responsibility, and his belief in his divinity became so deranged that he renamed Rome after himself the months of the year too, forcing every citizen to praise him as Hercules reborn, and his statues of him with bulging muscles and godlike poses filled the city. The real Commodus walked its streets dressed in golden armor, drunk on his own image, punishing anyone who didn't bow low enough, forcing people to kiss his feet or be branded as traitors. And when one senator refused to call him a god, Commodus made a public example of him, ordering his tongue torn out, his eyes gouged, and his body displayed in the arena as a lesson in respect. And every nobleman who once believed in tradition now lived in terror, because their survival hinged not on loyalty, but on pretending to enjoy the show, clapping with fake smiles while the emperor danced with blood on his hands, and what Rome once feared in barbarians, it now saw in its own leader, a man more savage than any foreign enemy, more beast than man, hiding behind silk robes and golden wreaths, while he crushed dignity, reason, and morality beneath his sandals. And as his laughter echoed through the Colosseum, louder than the screams of the dying, the city realized too late that the arena had become the throne, the emperor its champion, and cruelty the only law left in Rome. Chapter 2. Gladiator-Emperor. He wasn't content to rule Rome from a throne. He needed to stand in the blood-soaked dirt, sword in hand, face lit by torches, while men begged for their lives and the crowd screamed for more. Commodus, emperor of the civilized world, descended into the filth of the gladiatorial pits not as a spectator, but as a butcher in disguise, casting off his imperial robes to fight like a beast while slaves, criminals, and captives were lined up to die for his pleasure. And these weren't fair battles. He demanded the weakest, the sick, the disarmed, tied and trembling, sometimes even blindfolded, so he could slaughter them with dramatic flair. And when he stepped into the arena, dressed in golden armor with lions embroidered on his chest, and a polished blade sharpened to a whisper's edge, he was playing a god among vermin, turning execution into theater, and his cruelty bled far beyond the amphitheater. He ordered rare exotic animals imported, giraffes, elephants, ostriches, only to mutilate them in front of the public, laughing as he beheaded an ostrich and mockingly waved its severed head at the senators watching, as if to say, "You're next." And when a disabled gladiator displeased him by falling too quickly, Commodus didn't kill him in a clean blow. He dragged the dying man across the sand by his hair and carved open his stomach as the audience gagged and children cried. And yet no one dared stop him, because Commodus turned the games into a weapon, a ritual of terror, a message to the people that death meant nothing, and life was a currency only he could spend. And while gladiators trained for years to earn respect, he bought victories with gold and fear, demanding dozens of opponents at once, sometimes standing behind a net or shield wall, hurling javelins into their backs as they fled like animals. And still he counted each corpse as a personal triumph, celebrating them as military victories, bragging that he had won 1,000 battles. And those who dared whisper that it was cowardice, not courage, that fueled him were hunted down by his spies, dragged from their homes at night, and strangled quietly in their beds, their tongues cut out and nailed to the gates of the gladiator school as a warning. And his obsession twisted further when he began branding his name onto the bodies of the defeated, burning Commodus the victor into their flesh, and then parading them through the streets like trophies of war, naked and mutilated, while he rode behind them on a chariot made of ivory and bone, waving to a population too terrified to look away. And worse still were the private games, the ones the public never saw, held deep beneath the palace in torchlit chambers where no rules applied, where young slaves were dressed as mythical beasts and forced to fight the emperor in mock duels that always ended with a real death. And sometimes after the kill, Commodus would leave the body untouched for hours, meditating beside it as if absorbing its life force, whispering to the corpse as if it were some divine sacrifice to his own ego. And there were rumors of the blood rituals, whispered by trembling guards who swore they saw him bathed in the warm blood of his victims, painting symbols on his chest with it, believing it gave him invincibility. And when one of his concubines begged him to stop, saying the gods would punish such defilement, he had her chained in a cell with a starving lion and forced his guards to watch as the beast ripped her apart. Then, when it was done, he fed the lion himself, giggling as if he had just watched a comedy. And soon the very idea of mercy vanished from Rome, replaced with his sickness, his hunger, his madness for control through carnage. And each arena performance became darker than the last, with flaming chariots, crucifixions, flayed victims, even mock naval battles in flooded amphitheaters where prisoners were tossed to crocodiles with no chance to swim. And he watched it all with wide eyes, clapping and cheering, as if he were a child at a festival, not the architect of a waking nightmare. And the city learned to pretend. Pretend it was entertainment. Pretend it was justice. Pretend the emperor wasn't a creature wearing human skin, soaked in death and calling it divine right. And those who failed to pretend found themselves in the dirt beside his other victims. Because Commodus didn't just kill bodies. He killed truth, shame, and sanity, until Rome forgot what humanity looked like and learned to fear the sound of sandals echoing down marble halls. Because if you heard them, it meant he had chosen you for his next show. Chapter 3. A Palace of Corpses. The palace wasn't made of marble anymore. It was built from silence, fear, and bones buried beneath the tiles, where the scent of perfume struggled to cover the rot of death that clung to every corridor. Because under Commodus, the imperial residence turned into a slaughterhouse of the elite, and behind its velvet curtains and golden statues, nobles disappeared without explanation. Their bodies never found, their names scratched off records like they never existed, while those who remained learned that even a sigh too loud or a glance too long could invite the emperor's wrath. for his paranoia had grown into something feral and blood-hungry, infecting the walls of his palace like mold. He trusted no one, not his guards, not his advisors, not even his lovers. And each night he would pace through the halls armed with a dagger, eyes wild, muttering about betrayal, convinced that shadows whispered secrets about him, and in his madness, he created hidden torture rooms, chambers filled with chains, branding irons and sharp hooks, where he would interrogate senators himself, accusing them of treason without proof, their screams echoing beneath the dining halls where he hosted banquets just above, laughing with foreign ambassadors while the floorboards trembled with agony beneath their feet. And his methods were not quick. He believed pain was the only path to truth. So he had torturers trained to keep a man alive for days, slicing inch by inch, breaking bones with soft mallets, pouring boiling oil into wounds while recording every moan to be replayed during his feasts as entertainment. And when that no longer satisfied him, he began poisoning his guests, testing new toxins on their wine, smiling as they coughed blood into silk napkins, while pretending to enjoy the meal, because to show discomfort was to confess guilt, and guilt under Commodus meant death, and those who were too clever to drink were sometimes found strangled in their sleep by palace slaves who had no choice, either kill or be killed, and the emperor rewarded these assassins not with gold, but with silence, erasing their identities so no one could question them, so even the murderers became ghosts in a palace already full of them. And the deeper one went into the imperial residence, the darker it became. There were secret rooms where the heads of traitors were stored in jars, their faces twisted in eternal terror, labeled by name. And Commodus would sometimes visit them late at night, talking to them as if they were still alive, asking questions, mocking them, waiting for answers that never came. And worse still were the mirror rooms, chambers where every surface reflected his image, where he would strip naked and cover himself in the blood of his enemies, walking in circles like a wild beast, chanting praises to himself while hallucinating visions of betrayal. And anyone who dared enter uninvited was nailed to the door as a warning, left to rot until their bodies fell apart from decay, and the stench became so unbearable that servants begged to burn the corpses, only to be burned themselves for daring to question the display. And Commodus began writing down his dreams, scrolls filled with names, faces, fears, suspicions, paranoid prophecies that predicted his assassination again and again. Yet instead of protecting himself with guards, he chose terror, murdering anyone who reminded him of the people in his visions, including family, old friends, and even children, if they bore a resemblance to some imagined threat. And the palace's servants walked like shadows, heads down, mouths shut, forced to clean blood from rugs in the morning and serve wine at night as if nothing had happened, because they knew what lay in the cold rooms beneath the emperor's bedchamber. A pit, a real pit, deep and dark, filled with the bones of the accused, the forgotten, the innocent, and every week Commodus would visit it, standing over the edge, whispering to the dead, tossing coins into the pile as if paying toll to the underworld for their silence. And if he saw a rat moving among the bones, he'd laugh and call it a senator, return to life, then order it caught, tortured, and fed to a hawk for sport. And soon his madness became infectious, because to live near him meant abandoning your conscience, your morality, your soul, and everyone in that cursed palace had blood on their hands, either by force or fear, turning Rome's sacred seat of power into a haunted tomb, a place where screams were normal, where blood soaked the linens, and where the emperor slept soundly atop a kingdom of corpses, convinced that only his cruelty kept the walls from collapsing in on him. Chapter 4. God of Death. It was no longer enough for Commodus to be feared. He wanted to be worshipped, not as a ruler, but as a living god, the reincarnation of Hercules with a crown of madness and a hunger for submission. And so the temples of Rome were defiled and reborn in his image, statues of Jupiter torn down and replaced with grotesque monuments of Commodus himself wielding a club, crushing the heads of lions and men alike, and the priests who hesitated to perform these rites were flayed alive in front of their congregations, their skins nailed to the temple doors as sacred warnings, while the people were forced to bow not only to the emperor, but to the idea of him, an all-powerful, wrathful deity whose commandments were written in blood, not scripture. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles, reshaping the calendar like clay, and demanded that every letter, every decree, every coin in circulation carry his divine signature. And when a group of scribes failed to format an inscription exactly to his liking, they were dragged into the palace gardens and used as human targets in a grotesque game of archery, with the emperor laughing and taking bets on who would die first. And still, the Senate remained paralyzed in fear, now forced to address him in formal documents, not as emperor or Caesar, but as Hercules, savior of Rome, bringer of light, and lord of death. And those who hesitated, those whose voices trembled, were taken into the hall of mass, a special chamber where Commodus kept dozens of wax masks made in the likenesses of fallen gods. And he would force the accused to wear these masks while being tortured, as if mocking their humanity, pretending to execute Jupiter, Mars, or Apollo, reminding everyone that he, Commodus, was the last and only true divinity in the empire. He created a council of priests sworn to his worship, men so terrified they cut out their own tongues in silence just to avoid saying something wrong. And in place of religious festivals, Commodus invented brutal orgies of sacrifice, where hundreds of animals and slaves were killed in a single night, their blood collected in golden basins and poured over statues of him, while choirs sang praises to his perfection. And if the singing was off-key or a dancer missed a step, they were immediately executed on stage, their bodies dragged into the fire pits that roared behind the altar, turning worship into spectacle and ash. And his obsession only deepened when he ordered a sacred relic made, a cloak woven from the hair of murdered virgins, worn during midnight rituals in which he stood in the center of a circle of torches, chanting incantations in a language no one understood. Eyes rolled back, speaking to invisible gods, or perhaps to his own reflection, as slaves were thrown alive into the flames around him, their screams drowned by his howling laughter. And when plague returned to the streets of Rome, the people begged for help, for medicine, for shelter, but Commodus declared it divine punishment for doubt, and instead of aid, he built altars in every district, forcing citizens to kneel and pray to him under threat of death. And when the disease worsened, he accused entire neighborhoods of sacrilege, sending soldiers to burn them to the ground, families still inside, screaming for mercy that would never come. And his priests, drunk on fear, claimed the ashes purified the city, while Commodus stood at the Palatine Hill watching the smoke rise, arms outstretched like a savior, whispering, "You will love me or you will burn." And it wasn't just the public that suffered. He turned his wrath inward too, punishing his own staff for imagined blasphemies, like a slave girl who tripped while carrying incense, whom he crucified upside down and disemboweled personally, while demanding the court artists sketch the scene as a holy vision. And he later had those drawings displayed in temples, forcing the public to stare at them as part of their devotion. And worse still, he began forging his own gospel, scrolls filled with visions of apocalypse, where he reigned alone at the end of time, floating above a dead earth with piles of bodies beneath him. And he believed these dreams were prophecy, punishing anyone who questioned them, including philosophers, scholars, and poets, many of whom were burned alive with their own writings stuffed into their mouths. And one by one, the thinkers of Rome fell silent, the libraries dimmed, and faith became a curse word unless it was faith in him, the god of death who demanded obedience through agony and praise through terror. Until the city knelt not out of love, but survival, praying to a man who had no soul, only power, and a bottomless need to be worshipped in the language of fire, torture, and blood. Chapter 5. Rome on Sale. Rome was no longer a republic in name, nor even an empire in spirit. It was a marketplace of decay, where justice, power, and honor were measured not by merit, but by coin. And Commodus stood at the center of it all, auctioning off the soul of the city like a butcher carving up a corpse, piece by rotten piece. He turned the Senate into a brothel of loyalty, where titles were sold to the highest bidder, and noble blood was replaced by gold-stained hands. And the ancient halls where Cicero once spoke echoed now, with the rustling of bribes, the clink of stolen silver, and the laughter of fools who had bought their way into history. And Commodus didn't care who they were, criminals, ex-slaves, foreign merchants. If they paid enough, they became tribunes, praetors, generals, even consuls. And for the right price, a man could buy the authority to command a legion, to judge a province, or to have someone executed without trial. And the city's institutions, once sacred, were now bloodied pawns in a game of greed. And as Rome crumbled under corruption, Commodus grew fat on its bones, erecting new palaces with the money he wrung from the desperate and the damned. and his agents spread across the empire like locusts, blackmailing governors, seizing estates, forcing wealthy families to purchase their safety 1 month at a time. And when someone failed to pay, their homes were burned, their children enslaved, and their bodies dumped in the Tiber with forged confessions pinned to their chests. And the emperor, delighted by the flood of stolen wealth, began inventing offices just to sell them. Titles that meant nothing except that they carried a price, and every transaction fed his gluttonous ego, until even the priesthoods were sold like merchandise, and temples fell into the hands of gamblers, drunkards, and perverts who used sacred rituals as cover for orgies, sacrifices, and unspeakable games. And the army, once Rome's shield, became a whorehouse of politics, where soldiers were promoted not for valor, but for payment, and legions began fighting each other over bribes. Loyalty fractured, unity dead. And through it all, Commodus smiled, calling it divine economy, claiming that only he could determine a man's worth because only he was above value. And when a group of senators tried to protest the destruction of Rome's dignity, he mocked them by holding a public auction on the Senate floor, selling one man's chair for a handful of coins, another's title for a slave girl, and then ordering both executed for treason, with their heads displayed beside the auctioneer's stall as decoration. And soon every province learned the truth. Law no longer mattered. Only access to the emperor's greed, and provinces were leased like farmland. Governors treated their regions as personal businesses, and taxation became extortion, with the poor starving while corrupt officials built towers of marble and bathed in perfume. And when famine hit the countryside, Commodus's answer was to raise the price of every government post, believing scarcity made men more desperate and more profitable. And when Rome's grain supply dwindled, he sold the control of food distribution to one of his concubines, a woman with no experience but a bottomless appetite for gold. And the city nearly starved while she sold flour like precious gems, hoarding the profits while riots broke out in the streets. And still Commodus did nothing but count his coin, locked in a palace where each room had a different currency theme. Gold leaf walls, silver-tiled floors, gemstone chandeliers. And at the heart of it all sat his private vault, not just filled with wealth, but decorated with the tongues of those who once spoke against him, preserved in crystal jars, each labeled with the price of the office they dared criticize. And as Rome fell deeper into ruin, Commodus believed he was reshaping the world into a kingdom of wealth and fear, where everything had a price: loyalty, truth, even life. And he crowned himself not just emperor, not just god, but auctioneer of empires, laughing as the eternal city rotted from the inside, its values sold to the wind, its heart drowned in gold, and its people too broken to remember that once, long ago, Rome could not be bought. Chapter 6. His Harem of Fear. They called it the Palace of the Gods, but behind those gilded doors it was a slaughterhouse of innocence. Commodus, the self-proclaimed Hercules reborn, had turned Rome's most sacred halls into chambers of torment. This was no place of politics or strategy. It was a playground built on screams. While Rome rotted under the weight of his madness, the emperor's nights were filled with whispered cries, muffled sobs, and the chilling silence of those who had vanished forever. Commodus did not seek love nor lust. What he craved was domination, the kind that crushed not just bodies but souls. His harem wasn't simply a collection of lovers. It was a prison for the powerful, a graveyard for noble names, and a throne room for terror. He began by seizing the wives and daughters of senators, generals, and the elite, those whose status once protected them from the wolves of Rome. But not from Commodus. With a snap of his fingers, guards would drag them from their homes in the dead of night. No explanations, no resistance. They were paraded through the city like spoils of war, wrapped in silks too fine to conceal the fear in their eyes. Their families, too paralyzed by fear to speak, watched their bloodline disappear into the emperor's darkness. No letters came. No bodies were returned. Only rumors. Inside the palace, the emperor surrounded himself with beauty tainted by fear. Dozens of women, each more terrified than the last, were dressed like goddesses, adorned with gold and perfume. But their eyes told a different story, one of dread, humiliation, and the constant shadow of death. Commodus believed himself a god, and gods, he thought, took what they pleased. Refusing him was not an option. It was a death sentence. Some tried to fight. Others tried to escape. Few lived to try twice. The walls of his chambers were soundproof not for luxury, but for secrecy. No one outside ever heard the screams. He didn't just use them, he broke them. He would force the women to kneel before him, to worship him as a divine being, to call him Hercules, Jupiter, or whatever god he fancied that night. He'd reenact sacred rituals where he played the conqueror and they, unwilling priestesses. Some he scarred, both physically and mentally. Others were branded, marked with symbols of his sick dominion, and when they no longer amused him, he'd hand them off to his inner circle like discarded toys, or worse, order them executed in silence. No one could question where they had gone. They had never truly existed. Not in Commodus's version of Rome. But even that wasn't enough for him. Commodus began collecting not just women of noble birth, but those with rare appearances, foreign captives, twins, acrobats, even children. The darker the secret, the more he indulged. Witnesses whispered of chambers where the emperor made his victims fight for his amusement, sometimes pitting one terrified girl against another, promising freedom to the survivor, only to betray them both. These weren't fantasies. They were horrors staged for his private amusement, a sick theater where he always played the god, and everyone else, a pawn or a corpse. One of his most depraved acts involved a senator's wife, renowned for her wisdom and dignity. Commodus had her abducted after she dared to question a law in court. Inside his palace, he humiliated her, dressed her in rags, forced her to serve wine to other captives, and proclaimed her a fallen goddess. For days she was tormented in front of Rome's most perverse eyes, until Commodus, bored and furious she wouldn't cry, ordered her death by strangulation, with her own ceremonial gown. Her body was never returned. Her name was struck from official records, a warning to every other woman. Silence was survival. It wasn't just physical domination, it was political warfare. Each woman in his harem symbolized the fall of a rival, the humiliation of a family, the extinction of a legacy. With every abduction, he crushed another lineage. With every act of cruelty, he wrote a darker chapter in Rome's descent. The Senate was powerless. The people were too afraid. His guards were too loyal, or too wicked, to intervene. Even his inner circle, those closest to him, dared not speak of what they saw. To speak was to die. There were whispers of rituals in the moonlight, ceremonies where Commodus forced his victims to chant prayers to him while he stood naked, blood-stained, sword in hand. Some say he would drink from chalices fashioned from skulls. Others claim he kept a secret garden filled with gravestones, each marking a woman he had taken and discarded. No one knows if it was real, but in Rome, when a story sticks, it's usually rooted in something far worse than fiction. And yet, through it all, Commodus painted himself as a divine protector of the city. He paraded through Rome dressed in lion skins, muscles glistening, proclaiming that the gods had chosen him to purify the empire. But there was no purity, only perversion, no love, only torment. The emperor had turned intimacy into a weapon and worship into a curse. And as his madness deepened, so did the cruelty. The harem grew, the bodies vanished, the silence thickened. By the end, even his closest advisors began to fear what would happen if they brought their wives or daughters near the palace. Some fled the city, others bribed guards to lie about their family's whereabouts. A few faked deaths, hoping to keep their loved ones from the emperor's grasp. But no trick lasted long. Commodus was obsessed, not with passion, but with power. Every woman he seized was another reminder to Rome. No one was untouchable. He ruled through seduction, fear, and annihilation. And long after his body turned to dust, the walls of his palace whispered with the cries of the forgotten. Because in the harem of Commodus, the only thing louder than silence was the fear of who would vanish next. He smiled as the sword fell, smiled as if watching a comedy, while the man who once poured wine for him whispered state secrets in his ear, begged for mercy with blood on his lips. Commodus didn't need enemies. He made victims of those who loved him most. In the marble corridors of the palace, friendship was not a blessing, it was a death sentence. He trusted no one, not even those who helped build his throne. At first, Rome's elite thought they were safe, basking in favor, dining at his side. But as paranoia consumed him, Commodus began to see shadows in every room, betrayal in every glance, poison in every goblet. And so, to stay alive, he killed. Lucius Antistius Burrus, once a loyal ally and respected senator, was the first among many to fall. Accused of plotting against the emperor, He was dragged in chains before the imperial court. The charges were flimsy, the evidence laughable. But Commodus didn't need facts. He needed blood. Burrus's execution was public, brutal, and final. His screams echoed through Rome's streets, a warning to every so-called friend. Loyalty meant nothing when madness ruled. The people whispered that Commodus smiled through the entire trial, then toasted the man's death that night with vintage wine, his goblet rim still warm from the fire that burned Burrus's corpse. But the killings weren't just political, they were personal. Cleander, once Commodus's most powerful freedman and confidant, was like a brother to him. The two had risen together, Cleander serving as a shadow ruler, while Commodus basked in glory. Yet as Cleander's influence grew, so did Commodus's jealousy. Rome had started to fear Cleander more than the emperor himself. That was unacceptable. So Commodus did what he always did. He unleashed the mob. A grain shortage was blamed on Cleander, and with a nod from the emperor, an angry crowd stormed his estate. Cleander ran to Commodus for help, pounding on the palace gates. The emperor ordered them shut. Then he stood at the balcony and watched as his oldest friend was torn to pieces by the same people who once bowed at his feet. Later that night, Commodus told his inner circle, "No man should stand taller than a god." Even his lovers were not spared. One woman, Marcia, had been his mistress, his companion, and the closest thing he ever had to a heart. She read to him, soothed his rages, and pleaded for the lives of his victims. At times, she was the only voice that could calm the storm inside him. But when she accidentally learned of his plans to execute senators en masse, she begged him to reconsider. In return, Commodus added her name to the execution list. Marcia, his lover, condemned to die for loving him too deeply. Her crime was compassion. She survived only because she struck first, poisoning his wine before he could give the order. But in the final days before her betrayal, she lived in terror, watching his eyes grow colder, his love turn into a silent hunt. The darkness went beyond individual killings. Commodus surrounded himself with a rotating door of sycophants, fools, and cowards, men who would flatter his ego to survive another day. He appointed a man who once juggled in the streets as a military commander. Another advisor had been a charioteer, selected not for his wisdom, but for his ability to amuse. Real advisors, real generals, men with knowledge and experience, they disappeared. Some were stabbed in their sleep, others framed for crimes they didn't commit. One was fed to lions under the false charge of sacrilege. Rome became a graveyard of intellect, a land where the wise were hunted and the madmen danced in marble halls. Worse still were the whispers of what happened behind closed doors. Commodus didn't just execute his friends, he humiliated them. Before death, some were forced to kneel, kiss his feet, or declare him a god. Others were stripped naked and paraded through the streets before the killing blow. He once forced a nobleman to dress as a clown and entertain guests at a feast, then slit his throat mid-performance to the laughter of the court. Each death was a performance, each betrayal a spectacle. This wasn't politics, it was theater, a horror show where Commodus was both director and star. His sister Lucilla once plotted against him. She had seen the monster behind the crown and tried to end it before it consumed Rome. When the plot failed, Commodus didn't just kill her. He paraded her through the streets in chains, her royal robes torn from her body, her dignity erased. He wanted Rome to see that bloodline meant nothing to him. That family was just another word for future corpse. Her execution was drawn out, her suffering extended. Rome's citizens were made to watch. "Let them learn," he said, "what happens to those who call themselves my kin." Even the Praetorian Guard, those sworn to protect him, lived in fear. Their loyalty was rewarded with suspicion. He rotated commanders frequently, ensuring no man gained too much power. Once a guard captain refused to salute him as Hercules. Commodus had him beaten with iron rods until his skull cracked open. His corpse was hung at the palace gates with a sign that read, "Gods demand obedience." From that day on, even the fiercest warriors trembled when near him. No armor could protect them from a god's wrath. In private, Commodus spoke to himself, sometimes for hours, muttering the names of friends long dead, friends he had killed. Some said he saw their ghosts, that their eyes haunted him in the candlelight. But if guilt touched him, it never showed. He laughed at their memory, toasted to their demise, dared the spirits to haunt him. "Let them try," he once said, raising his goblet. "I sent them to hell. I'll do it again." By the time his reign neared its end, Commodus was alone. surrounded by flatterers too afraid to speak and shadows too silent to trust. Rome had become a city of mass, everyone smiling, everyone watching, no one breathing too loudly. Because in his empire, friendship was a risk, loyalty was a trap, and the closer you were to the emperor, the closer you were to death. He renamed every month after himself, every city a monument to his ego. The empire didn't belong to Rome, it belonged to him. When Rome heard its emperor declare that the calendar no longer belonged to the gods or the people but to him alone, it wasn't just a moment of absurdity, it was a declaration of psychological conquest. Commodus, the man once born into the noble Antonine dynasty, had now fractured into a man-god, drunk on delusion. January was now Amazonius. August, Commodus. Each month twisted into a new tribute to himself, carved in stone and law, enforced by blood. What had once been Rome's sacred rhythm of time was now rewritten into a hymn of narcissism. But these weren't just name changes. This was the emperor rewriting reality. One marble slab at a time, he began renaming cities after himself. Not a few, all of them. Carthage, Alexandria, even Rome. He rechristened them with names like Colonia Commodiana and Commoduspolis. Entire cities were forced to abandon centuries of identity to satisfy the emperor's diseased sense of immortality. And those who protested? They vanished. Their names erased from records, their homes seized, their corpses dumped in mass graves or fed to the river. If Commodus couldn't be everywhere, he would make it seem like he was. Every street echoed his name. Every temple bore his likeness. His ego wasn't contained by flesh. It was chiseled into the walls, sewn into the fabric of every province. The empire itself was just a mirror, and in it, Commodus saw a god. Marble statues of him flooded the empire, naked, muscular, and grinning with hollow eyes. But these weren't standard imperial busts. These were abominations of worship. In some, he posed as Hercules, wearing the lion's skin and gripping a club. In others, he held the severed heads of his enemies, sometimes modeled after senators he personally had executed. One chilling statue in the Forum depicted Commodus crushing a globe under his foot, declaring himself the conqueror of all earth and sea. When a sculptor refused to carve the emperor's genitals larger than Hercules, he was tortured and thrown from the Capitoline Hill. Commodus didn't want statues, he wanted relics of power that made men kneel. In the temples of Jupiter and Mars, Commodus replaced their altars with idols of himself. Worship of traditional gods was punished. Priests were forced to recite prayers to the son of Jupiter reborn, and those who hesitated were tortured until they confessed to heresy. He created his own personal cult, the cult of Commodus, and demanded that every household burn incense to his image. Across the empire, families wept as they watched statues of their ancient gods torn down and replaced with grinning effigies of a madman. Even the Vestal virgins were forced to bless his new religion or face public humiliation. He had taken the divine and made it grotesque. His obsession with marble went further. He rebuilt parts of Rome not out of civic duty, but to immortalize his sickness. The Colossus of Nero, which once stood near the Colosseum, was remade in Commodus's image, renamed the Colossus of Commodus. The emperor's face was forced onto coinage, temples, arches, and even the military standards of the legions. Refusing to carry his likeness into battle was considered treason. Soldiers who hid or damaged Commodus's effigy were flogged in public. One centurion, accused of spitting near a statue, had his tongue cut out and was sewn into a sack of snakes. Rome was no longer a city of stone. It was a graveyard of his sanity. He didn't just want power, he wanted to be the sun around which all of Rome orbited. Every law, decree, and ceremony began and ended with his name. He would force senators to chant his titles in unison for hours. Titles like the Invincible, the Merciful, the Earthquake of the East. Anyone who faltered in reciting them was whipped. On one terrifying occasion, a blind senator mispronounced invincible as invisible. The man was dragged from the hall and beaten to death by the Praetorian Guard. The message was clear. Commodus would not tolerate imperfection, even in worship. But the darkest act of all was what he did beneath the marble floors of his palaces. Hidden chambers filled with wax figures of enemies he had killed. Some posed in agony, their mouths frozen mid-scream. Others dripped with blood-colored paint, knives still lodged in their chests. Visitors to these rooms were forced to tour them like art galleries, nodding in admiration or risk being added to the collection. He once hosted a dinner party in one of these rooms, surrounded by these grotesque figures, calling it the banquet of justice. Laughter echoed between corpses as he toasted to his own greatness. Madness crept further when he declared that Rome itself must be rebuilt in his image, not just renamed, but redesigned. He ordered architects to draft blueprints for a new city layout, one shaped like his own face when viewed from above. Rivers would be redirected to flow through his eyes. Bridges would extend like arms from his temple. Streets would spiral from his navel. When engineers warned it was impossible, he had their hands broken so they could never insult architecture again. The plans were never realized, but the drawings hung in his palace like sacred scrolls. He believed Rome was not a city. It was his second skin. Even the gladiatorial games became monuments to his mania. Before entering the arena, every gladiator had to kneel and say, "Hail Commodus, god of blood and marble." Those who refused were slaughtered before the games began. Sometimes Commodus would take the stage himself, dressed in golden armor, striking dramatic poses before gutting a prisoner for the crowd's entertainment. He carved his initials into the chests of those he killed, not for identification, but as a declaration, Commodus was here. And as he stood before the cheering masses, their applause thunderous but hollow, he believed he had finally achieved what no emperor before him had: immortality in stone, in name, in fear. But the truth was darker. The empire had not become a reflection of his greatness. It had become a haunted mausoleum echoing his madness. Every statue, every coin, every renamed month was a scream carved into stone, a cry from a city begging to forget the face it was forced to worship. The Colosseum echoed with screams, not of wild beasts or foreign enemies, but of Romans themselves, torn apart for amusement under the watchful eyes of their emperor. Commodus, no longer content with gladiator games alone, transformed the arena into a slaughterhouse of paranoia and twisted joy. His lust for blood became the empire's daily ritual. He didn't just kill enemies, he hunted down his own citizens, orchestrating grotesque spectacles where senators were stripped of their dignity before being butchered like animals. Accusations of treason rained down with no warning, no trial, only execution. Friends, allies, lovers, all became targets in Commodus's game of death. He would host feasts where the entertainment wasn't music or dancers, but public mutilations. Tongues sliced out, limbs chopped off, eyes gouged under torchlight. He invited Rome's elite to watch, forcing them to smile through the carnage or risk joining the condemned. Commodus didn't see humans anymore. He saw props for his performances, playthings to bleed for his pleasure. His sword was no longer reserved for the arena. He would personally drag prisoners into the sand, dressed as Hercules, slicing their throats while roaring with laughter, smearing their blood on his face like war paint. Once he ordered a dozen physically deformed men brought in, tied them together, and clubbed them to death one by one, while mocking their groans as music fit for an emperor. Those who flinched or wept at the sight were seized on the spot and added to the next day's executions. Children of supposed traitors weren't spared either. Commodus ordered infants flung into fires, their cries drowned out by cheering soldiers too afraid to do anything but applaud. The emperor's garden became a graveyard, lined with heads impaled on spikes, each labeled with names of imaginary conspirators. An artist who sketched him with a crooked nose, a poet who failed to mention his greatness, a cook who once served him lukewarm wine. His cruelty infected the city like rot. At night, the streets of Rome echoed with the wails of families dragged from their homes, beaten until they confessed crimes they never committed. Commodus enjoyed watching the torture sessions, sometimes intervening with his own methods, branding flesh with hot irons or sewing mouths shut to silence pleas. He created a secret hall beneath the palace, a chamber of horror where screams were muffled by thick stone walls, and where he could indulge in cruelty away from public gaze. Naked bodies hung from hooks, their blood collected in silver bowls offered to his gods. He believed he was divine, that spilling blood purified the empire and fed his power. He began sacrificing senators to Jupiter, convinced it would make him immortal. The city bled, the Tiber ran dark, and the people no longer looked to the emperor as ruler, but as executioner-in-chief. Commodus's guards became butchers with titles, and his council chamber, a death sentence in disguise. If you spoke, you risked offending him. If you stayed silent, you risked suspicion. When Rome began to whisper of rebellion, he silenced it with even more terror. Whole families were erased in a single night. Their homes burned to the ground, their names removed from records. He demanded statues be erected, showing him stepping on decapitated heads, and inscriptions calling him the god who kills with beauty. He even changed the Roman calendar, naming days after his favorite tortures. The people had no festivals anymore, only days of fear. He created a festival of flames where prisoners were set ablaze in the streets, turned into human torches while dancers twirled around their charring corpses. His palace floors were washed with rose water in the morning and blood by night. Some claimed he drank it. Others swore he bathed in it. One servant who dared peek into his private quarters spoke of a bathtub stained red and the emperor humming lullabies while skinning a slave alive. The cruelty was no longer for power. It had become a craving, an obsession. He collected body parts in jars, stored them in his private vault. Heads, fingers, hearts, souvenirs of his reign. He ordered sculptors to create busts of himself smiling beside corpses, to remind future generations that even death bent the knee to him. But it wasn't just the victims who suffered. The entire empire had grown sick with dread. Farmers abandoned their land, soldiers deserted in secret, merchants whispered curses under their breath. Rome, once the heartbeat of civilization, now beat to the rhythm of executions. The Senate, broken and terrified, begged the gods for an end. Yet Commodus, wrapped in lion skins, swinging his club like a child with a toy, thought himself untouchable. His eyes, once sharp, now burned with delirium. His laughter echoed down corridors like a warning. His face, painted, powdered, perfect, masked the monster beneath. Every drop of blood spilled made him feel more alive. Every death whispered that he was a god. But beneath the marble halls and silken robes, the shadows whispered a different truth. The empire was dying, and its god was mad. The palace walls were no longer silent. They whispered, watched, and waited. Commodus, once the golden boy of Rome, had become a rotting god in his own house, worshipped only by those too afraid to blink in his presence. He had turned the imperial court into a circus of shadows, filling its halls with spies, assassins, and actors, paid to laugh at his madness. His meals were taste-tested, his robes examined for poison, his own pillow fluffed by trembling hands that feared they might be blamed for creases. Paranoia wasn't his sickness, it was his sustenance. He spoke to statues like they were senators and held trials for slaves who had never spoken. At night, his screams echoed through the halls, dreaming of betrayal even before it came. But it wasn't the generals who moved first, nor the senators who dared to strike. It was those who knew his face best. Marcia, once his mistress and confidant, had become disillusioned. She had watched him burn through Rome's dignity, butcher noble bloodlines, and sell off public offices like apples in a market. When she discovered her name on an imperial kill list, marked for death by morning, she did not cry. She did not beg. She found a blade sharper than his madness. But the real blade wasn't metal. It was a plan, cold and clean. With the help of Eclectus, his chamberlain, and Latus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, they carved the end of an empire, not with war, but with silence. On the final night, Commodus had just returned from the arena, drunk on blood and wine. His muscles glistened with oil, his eyes vacant with delusion. He believed he was Hercules reborn, destined to rule forever, sword in hand, Rome at his feet. He didn't notice the poison in his wine, slipped in by Marcia's trembling fingers. When it failed to kill him fast enough, a wrestler named Narcissus was summoned to finish what poison could not. Commodus lay in his bath, dazed but alive, when Narcissus wrapped his hands around the emperor's throat and squeezed. Not out of duty, but out of hatred. This was no quick death. It was personal, sweaty, and long. The emperor clawed, thrashed, gasped, but no one came to help. Not a guard, not a slave, not a friend, because by then Commodus had none. He died alone, face pressed into the filth of a marble floor, still clutching the wooden sword he once swung in the arena. But death wasn't his end. It was Rome's sigh of relief. The Senate, having lived under his thumb for years, declared his memory damnatio memoriae. Erased from official records, statues smashed, inscriptions scratched out. But no marble could hide what he had done. His reign had turned gladiator blood into policy, made murder into theater, and drowned Rome's dignity in the baths of his own madness. They found hidden rooms in the palace, small, windowless chambers where noble women were imprisoned and abused, their mouths sewn shut with thread to keep their screams from echoing. They uncovered secret ledgers filled with names, marked for execution not by guilt but by whim. He had ordered the deaths of his own illegitimate children, calling them accidents in the margins. A wall in his private quarters was painted with images of senators disemboweled, drawn by his own hand in the blood of a butchered lamb. And his pet projects? One was a pit beneath the palace, filled with starving wolves, where disobedient servants were thrown. Another was a golden throne mounted on a rotating platform that spun slowly while he hurled insults at chained diplomats. These weren't rumors. These were the truths the Senate tried to bury, only to find that Rome itself had begun to rot from remembering. The man who made Rome his stage, who wore lion skins and called himself a god, had been undone not by war, but by a woman with a pen, a slave with a cup, and a wrestler with calloused hands. And still, there were those who wept. The crowds who had cheered for him in the Colosseum, who watched him slay beasts in the arena and believed him divine, now wandered through the streets in confusion. Some even cursed Marcia for killing a god, but others, those who had lost fathers, brothers, daughters to his cruelty, placed offerings at his desecrated statues. Not in mourning, but in gratitude. The tyrant was dead, but the scars he left were carved deeper than marble. They were etched into the soul of Rome itself. And as his corpse cooled in the palace he had renamed after himself, the empire exhaled not in sorrow, but in relief. The curtain had fallen. The actor was gone. And Rome, bloodied and broken, would never forget the horror of a stage ruled by madness. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of history, the madness, the murder, the emperors who bled their empires dry, don't just watch, descend deeper. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and join us as we uncover the secrets Rome tried to bury. Because the bloodstains of the past still whisper, and we're here to listen.